why are pathological demand avoidance / persistent drive for autonomy, PDA in brackets, intrinsically ableist terms by Richard Woods, London South Bank University PhD student during May 2023. So yeah, this a quick note on conflicts of interest. So I have been developing various PDA tools such as the pathological demand avoidance belief scale. I do earn some income from delivering training sessions on PDA, and I reluctantly advocate that PDA should be diagnosed as a standalone construct. So a bit about my perspective. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I do meet Elizabeth Neese's PDA profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it. I presently am no longer basing my identity on diagnostic categories like PDA, autism, or ADHD, for example, partly because I favour a transdiagnostic approach to such matters, and that we should be aspiring to stop using diagnostic categories like ASD and PDA, etc. So yeah, I mean, my agenda is for at least inclusive equality, scientific, method-based research and practice for autism. And I'm doing a PhD investigating PDA as part of the Critical Autism Disability Studies group at London South Bank University, and this is my interpretation of literature. Others may disagree. So, quick introduction. So, yeah, persistent drive for autonomy. What is it? And same, what is ableism? So, moving on to persistent drive for autonomy and neoliberalism. A brief case study. I will give trigger warnings about this because it is about kind of the case study involves Filicide, so that's a caregiver killing their child. I'll give trigger warnings at the time when I kind of before discussing it, so you have time to kind of like obviously not watch the video or skip it. Yeah. Also, PDA as a functioning category, and then kind of a quick point out that some claims around PDA seem to be nonsense, and then discussing what I use to drive for autonomy in my work, and then conclusion. So, yeah, the main discourse around PDA is that it was originally a pervasive mental disorder, and that it's now a rare autism profile subgroup subtype. Those things are used well, conceptually they're interchangeable. And if you actually check the PDA literature, it is being treated as an autism subgroup because it's traditionally, well, since around 2010-ish, it's been treated as an autism subgroup. So yeah, PDA is meant to have different strategies that are meant to have different strategies that are unique and different to those used with autism, and that it's mainly called pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance. Some people who identify with PDA are calling it persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy, which I have issues with, which is kind of the purpose of the talk. So yeah, as I was saying, this is just a quote from the PDA Society's what seems to be a research report that's pretending to be clinical guidelines. So by the PDA Society. So yeah, some PDA individuals refer to PDA as a pervasive drive for autonomy, and if you want the full context of that quote, it's in a section discussing kind of like how PDA is meant to have a need for control. I'm quite skeptical of that claim that PDA has a need for control, and I kind of touch on it a bit later. So yeah, in order to define how something is ableist, I need to have a definition for ableism. So the one that I use in my work is from Fiona Kumari Campbell from 2008, and it's from her article on internalized ableism. So she defines ableism as a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body. The corporeal standard, that's in brackets, that is projected as the perfect, species-typical, and therefore essential and fully human. Disability is cast as a diminished state of being human. So yeah, it's from page 153 of Campbell 2008. I need to mention a bit about neoliberalism. So this is from my first actual PDA talk in 2018, where I situate PDA in disability studies literature. So yeah, there's two arguments around how how persistent drive for autonomy is intrinsically ableist. The first incentive is around neoliberalism. So like Western cultures, particularly United States of America and the United Kingdom, are very neoliberal cultures. So yeah, it's part of that each person is meant to be independent, self-regulating individual. We're meant to seek help to kind of fix our faults, so we can be economically productive person. As part of this neoliberal culture, is that basically market. You're meant to have the free market. You're meant to unleash market forces. Everything. If it doesn't have a market, you're meant to create market forces internally within it. It's like one of the issues with the NHS in the UK, which is the um, National Health Service, sorry, is under Labour and particularly under the Tories, they've kind of created internal market forces, and it's one of the issues with the reforms to helping kind of people with autism and other disabilities in our UK education system is that it's become very marketised and kind of devolved with local level, and caregivers are meant to kind of negotiate and navigate their way through all these different market forces and market options, and it's just a mess and a fiasco in many respects. So yeah, moving on. Persistent drive for autonomy. At face value, a person has a constant drive for autonomy. So therefore, they're naturally an independent, self-regulating person, thriving while navigating through these unrestrained markets. To be a highly economically productive person. So what that means is, persistent drive for autonomy implies that a person is not disabled, and instead are perfectly adapted to live in the UK in, well, 2020s. So theoretically, persistent drive for autonomy is the poster boy for living in the UK today, which is a bit of a problem if you're trying to portray it as being a high disabling thing. So yeah, persistent drive for autonomy intrinsically holds these beliefs and processes that person is projected as being a perfect species, typical person, which should say people are kind of cast against if you kind of take it at face value. I accept that taking it at face value is not how those who use persistent drive for autonomy would like it to be taken. It's meant to be taken as a highly disabling thing, way of being human. So it's meant to be highly kind of disabling, highly impairing. And I'm using disabling within the medical context, and that quite. I tend to use impairment or impairing instead in my work, from like a social model of disability perspective. But yeah, so this takes us on to the second argument of it, is a persistent drive for autonomy is basically used interchangeably for need for control. So it's just that people who do not have a persistent drive for autonomy have a lesser drive for autonomy, or a lesser or no need for control. This is problematic, and it seems nonsense because most people, or if not all people, seem to benefit from being in charge, or having a sense of control. So yeah, it's a bit problematic. But if we ignore this, and we kind of ignore that it seems nonsense, and we kind of accept the kind of claim around pervasive drive for autonomy or persistent drive for autonomy / need for control, they are viewed as being excessive in nature, and therefore counts as an impairment because they're too much of something. So yeah, we kind of know when something should count clinically as count pathological, because the main American Diagnostic Manual kind of gives us a definition for when something counts as, when a feature becomes pathological, is literally pathologized at. So pathological demand avoidance, and therefore kind of like a pathological need for control or pathological drive for autonomy, will be impaired when the persistence causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of function. And these are all terms, so this is quite low. These are not ands. So it does not have to be pervasive to be pathological. So a persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy is literally saying that this aspect of themselves is a pathological in nature, i.e. a diminishing aspect of being human. So again, persistent drive for autonomy conforms with Campbell's definition for being of ableism. So yeah, and this is kind of get me on towards a kind of case study which I mentioned at the start. So let's talk about kind of persistent drive for autonomy and impairment. So persistent drive, persistent/pervasive drive for autonomy is another name for kind of PDA profile of ASD. I'm quite skeptical that PDA is a profile of ASD, and like you should be familiar with that because you're engaging with the video, but kind of moving on. So PDA Profile of ASD is being used as another functioning label, and we kind of see this from the case study, which I'm going to give in a moment. Giving you a trigger warning, so if you want to skip this section, which is going to be 3 or 4 slides, it is discussing kind of filicides, i.e. caregivers killing their child. So kind of giving you a trigger warning there. So the case study is from Ireland in 2019. So basically, a caregiver who was supposedly mentally unwell, their young child was recently diagnosed as autistic, described as having kind of mild autism. The caregiver thought that the child had PDA. The caregiver came across information PDA, became quite obsessed about it online, and it's kind of reflecting their internet search history at the time, and they killed their young child. I'm going to quote some parts from a news report on the kind of court case on the topic. So yeah, as I said, PDA is kind of described as a severe form of autism, and this is like a controversial and contested claim. So I'm going to read out a couple of the quotes. So in the 48 hours up to the killing, she had carried out internet searches on suicidal mothers killing their autistic children. She'd been convinced her child had a more severe form of autism when in reality the diagnosis was at the mild end of the spectrum. End of that quote. Move on to the next one. The court heard the woman had become obsessed and was devastated at her child's diagnosis. While the diagnosis was one of mild or borderline autism, she was convinced her child had a much more serious form of the condition and that she would not get adequate supports. And the final quote is that the woman's partner said she had convinced herself that the child had PDA, which does not respond to the usual treatments for autism, although the psychologist had told them the child had, at the very worst, mild autism. She had also said that the profile PDA did fit and she would send her report. There's so much wrong with these quotes from my perspective, which I'm going to get into some of it now. I also take issue with it being called a profile, and also around kind of the use of kind of treatments and other bits and pieces which I will touch upon. So yeah, PDA is described as a terrible form of autism and does not respond to usual autism treatments. And I would question who gave that information to caregiver, who's presented this information to caregivers. And I point out a bold claim that PDA does not respond to typical autism treatments and seems nonsense to me, which I'll go on to next. So yeah, I'm challenging like the claim that autism approaches are effective generally. So yes, we know from when autism subtypes were removed from the DSM-5 that they were partly removed due to the fact there was no evidence of differential treatment. So basically, the approaches that you use for one autistic person with kind of mild is basically the same as those with severe, and I am using mild and severe in quotation marks. David Milton also wrote in his 2013 essay, which was later published in 2017, which is why I'm referencing it as 2017. Damien Milton said that autistic persons note that traditional autism interventions are often ineffective, so often do not work with autistic persons. More recently, one of these kind of traditional autism approaches, which is called positive behaviour support, or which some people would say is basically applied behaviour analysis, recently said in the UK that PBS should only be used with those with intellectual disability, and this includes autistic people with intellectual disability. So that's a whole bunch of autistic people who are no longer meant to receive PBS, probably because it's ineffective with a lot of us. Most people would say it's ineffective with those with intellectual disability as well, but that's a tangent. More recently, and kind of arguably most compelling, was Sam McIntyre 2020 did a meta-analysis of early autism interventions and basically found that if you do a quality appraisal of them and you consider risk of bias, there's no evidence of treatment effects working at all, basically for any autism intervention. And it's a pretty comprehensive study by Sam McIntyre. I'd also point out, when we'll kind of touch upon this later, that if one considers the general state and well-being of the autistic population, it is generally very, very, very poor. We're suffering quite greatly, so this is why we have kind of like stupidly high suicide rates and other bits and pieces. If the autism approaches were working and effective, the general dire state of the autistic population would not exist. So it's it is disingenuous and misleading to claim that the kind of traditional autism approaches do not work for PDA compared to and that they're meant to work for autistic people, because generally they seem not to. So yeah, I'm going to present a new diagram in a couple of slides' time, but I'm going to show that this diagram is based on my previous work. So some of you might be familiar with this table. So this is a table which shows different diagnostic thresholds for PDA versus diagnostic thresholds in the PDA literature and the DSM-5 for other diagnostic categories. So on the left-hand side, you have the oppositional defiant disorder specifiers. So you have mild, which is the features only present in one setting, moderate is at least in two settings, and severe set of behaviours present in at least three settings. So if you compare like ADHD diagnostic threshold, it says that the behaviour should be seen in at least two settings, and one of those is social. For autism, is that autistic features must show in at least three settings, and that also directly corresponds to the threshold for PDA Profile of ASD or extreme demand-avoidance, as done by Helpful Psychology in their work. So they would also argue that they would claim there's a rational demand avoidance, so that would only be seen in one setting, and that would be equivalent to kind of mild PDA here. I don't agree with these differences. It's just what they're claiming and working with. It's quite interesting. If you look at obsessive compulsive disorder, that threshold is that features must be seen in at least one setting, and also for at least 1 hour a day. And it's also like it must cause significant stress or impairment as well. And oppositional defiant disorder is really quite interesting because it must be seen in at least one setting, but the behaviours do not have to be impairing to an individual. They can just cause lots of problems for other people around them. If people are familiar with my work, they will know that I tend to use a transactional stress model, so that basically the demand-avoidance features are not rooted as intrinsic features to the individual, so they're often triggered or caused by interactions with the environment. I had taken a low threshold for it, so it's only seen in one setting, and sorry, I just lost the mouse there, so I was trying to find it. And that kind of the more stress and distress a person is, the more features that these demand-avoidance features will be seen in. So I'm kind of creating this transactional stress model with different diagnostic thresholds for PDA in the literature and stuff. So if I move on to the next one, so this is a diagram which kind of builds on that table. So it's a continuum of internalised and externalising features. So internalising is kind of stuff like kind of fancy role playing, kind of masking, and externalising is the kind of like rapid mood changes and the kind of the social, most social avoidance features like the acts of violence or kind of incapacitating yourself. So you can so you have the internalising spectrum over here, and the externalising spectrum end of it over here. So there's a continuum of how the features kind of present, and this is kind of number of settings in which the features presented. So obviously subclinical PDA will be here, so they're not really presented consistently at all, to kind of consistently expressed in its one setting, consistently expressed in these two settings, and consistently expressed in these three, so it'd be kind of pervasive. So I've kind of equated diagnostic thresholds on the right hand side here. So again, you can see like mild equivalent to the EDAQ, or oppositional defiant disorder. Moderate is kind of equivalent to DSM-5 ADHD, and PDA Profile of ASD equivalent to DSM-5 autism here. So where am I going with this? So this is a diagram for me to kind of show that PDA or positional drive for autonomy is intrinsically an ableist term. So this is a continuum of demand avoidance, with demand avoidance at the top to demand compliance at the bottom. So a quick note of please do not reify this diagram, because it assumes that demand avoidance is intrinsic to the individual, when I don't think it is. I think demand avoidance is intrinsically it's an actually transactional thing. But is aimed to discussing how PDAs are functional level. So, and this down here is again me pointing out the threshold in which demand avoidance and hyperfawning. So hyperfawning is basically excessive kind of appeasing and being excessively nice when you kind of people place demands on you, just appease them and kind of go along with you want them to go. I'd also point out some people would say that you can high perform as part of avoiding demands. But where am I going with this? So yeah, at the top end you have the demand avoidance, and I've obviously graded them out. So you've got kind of mild down here, again, one context, moderate PDA, well, demand avoidance is seen in two contexts, and severe in three. And you can see I've created the same diagnostic thresholds from the previous diagram. I've just put them in here. But you can also use the same principles to pathologise high performing. So high performing, if it's causing hyper distress or problems like significant impairment in at least one setting, it'll be like mild, and getting two be moderate, and getting three. So what I'm saying is, if you're saying here, which will be persistent drive for autonomy, you're automatically saying that you're more impaired, and anyone else without it is less impaired down here. So it's intrinsically based around a kind of as a categorical functioning label, PDA, as a form of autism is, which includes persistent drive for autonomy. So yeah, I kind of just covered that. I discussed how it can be modeled different severity levels. So yeah, there are other diagnostic thresholds in literature which I've kind of already covered. Yeah, but I'd also point out the key bit here is that often differences between functioning categories are arbitrary and subjective, and where a person presents in such continuums is frequently dependent on the person's age, situation, and stress levels. And we kind of notice, for example, a lot of autistic people will become minimal to non-speaking when they're highly stressed, or even just stressed generally. So the size of the autistic non-speaking population is highly variable amongst time and space and situations various people are in. So yeah, drive for autonomy is used to claim why demand avoidance, my drive for autonomy, my need for control is like different, therefore less impaired to it. So some PDA Profile of ASD advocates, like people with lived experience, they're claiming that my description of PDA do not match their lived experience. They're claiming that I don't have PDA, basically, which I think is nonsense. I'm being polite about that. So yeah, the base I've already said that. So, but it shows as part of a network of belief process and practice that produces a particular kind of self that's projected as a perfect sense. But it's also being used to others. It's being used to cast people as being different from them, and therefore not them, which I take issues with. So yeah, where do I say that? Must be elsewhere then. So yeah, these are just quotes around how PDA is being described. So this again from the PDA Society's kind of research, well, what seems to be a research report that pretends to be clinical guidance. So we're increasingly perplexed by the complex presentation of one of our service users and our team's inability to meet their needs despite our various best efforts. While she doesn't have a formal diagnosis, following PDA training, we're able to devise some unique strategies that have been highly effective. That's from like page 4 of it. So the next one is the primary reasons for identifying a PDA profile are to help individuals and those living and working with them make sense of a complex presentation that is otherwise difficult to explain, and to signpost different strategies and approaches. Again from page 4. So you've seen that PDA has been described as a complex presentation. People find it perplexing. The problem with that kind of language is you then have people who are like not complex, not perplexed, and therefore more straightforward. And people have described non-PDA autistics as more straightforward. And yeah, you can see how it's naturally creating differences between them. You to kind of differentiate and how support and don't. Oh, another quote. So again, this is from page 3 of the PDA Society's what seems to be a research report pretending to be clinical guidance. So as a result of broadening of the way that autism and the autism spectrum are seen, the contribution's views is that PDA is currently best understood as a profile for cluster of traits within the autism spectrum. I'm highly critical of that. If it's cluster of traits in the autism spectrum, therefore it's a subgroup. Yeah. If one accepts this quote, which I don't, but if one accepts it, that PDA features are part of the autism spectrum, that means that these features will form continuums or spectrums of features within the autism spectrum. So I'm using kind of continua, which I think is the correct word for continuums. But yeah, I'm going to get onto another diagram, but I need to show how I got to this new diagram of mine. So you should probably be familiar with this diagram of mine. So this shows kind of the DSM-5 autism criteria on the left and the aggregated PDA profile on the right. So you've got the 3 socialization issues here, the 4 restricted behaviour interests here, and autism must be from early infancy. So you've got a bit of overlap with social communication issues, primarily because some autistic people pass through mind tests, and PDAs are not meant to have any through mind issues. PDAs are meant to be due to anxiety, so separate, because anxiety is not meant to be intrinsic aspect of autism. And then you got kind of the mental aspects of PDA here, which are optional, and I've obviously got the social communication issues of PDA, it's optional. So moving on, the next diagram is got aggregate PDA features here, DSM-5 autism here, and no proposals autism group of profound autism here. Profound autism is quite interesting because in this aspect, it's because it is literally using non-autism difficulties to create an autism subgroup, and they deliberately use intellectual disability and or language impairment to do that. So you got social communication issues here, the RRBIs and stuff here in DSM-5 autism, and in the aggregate PDA DSM-5 profile here, you've got the atypical social interaction, the kind of the anxiety, impulsive, rapid mood changes, obsessive behaviour, demand avoidance, fantasy and role play. You got this stuff here basically. I need to check this diagram out. Didn't realise that until now. Yeah. So this is a new diagram. So can I scroll back here briefly? So this is the diagram is literally this bit here. So I'm literally showing that these PDA features are continuous within the autism spectrum if you accept the quote, which I don't, but we'll run with it. So yeah, and these features here are mainly the PDA features taken from the previous diagram, which is this diagram here. So just gonna let people going to keep on here for a minute, for a second, just to allow people to kind of process it and go back. So yeah, brief note: please do not reify this diagram. It's based on my interpretation of literature, because some people might take issues with me saying that it has no theory of mind issues, but I would argue there's quite good reasons for that, such as empirical evidence indicating that PDA has no theory of mind issues. I'd also point out that if you're doing a load of these behaviours, you need to have criminal intent and therefore mean to do it. And therefore, if you're meaning to do it, therefore understand what you're doing. Therefore, kind of like you have fear of mind in order to do that. So, left-hand side, you have PDA features here, and right-hand side, you have what I would call autism, or what PDA Profile Autism supporters would call classic, more straightforward autism. I would point out that left-hand side, it's mainly just co-occurring difficulties of features like ADHD, anxiety, conduct disorder, defiant disorder, and trauma features here. And on the right-hand side, the classic more straightforward autism is just autism. I don't agree with all of these being purely autism, because some of them I think you could kind of question, like the theory of mind stuff, because theory of mind's got a really poor evidence base and a lot of people are critiquing it. So it's why like deficits in autism and quotation marks. But so these continuum lines, they have got red for noticing kind of impairing or kind of more problematic, green to show that kind of less, they're basically not a problem. So you got anxiety here, so high for PDA. Avoidance on demand is kind of high, again, kind of bullying, harassment, kind of fantasy and role play is meant to be not be a problem. It's meant to be impaired in autism. Impulsivity, kind of obsessive behaviour that's focused on other people. Kind of a need for control, drive for autonomy, like rapid mood changes. Social strategic mix of avoidance behaviours. To me, they're the kind of same thing. There's good reasons for me to argue that, which I argue in a recent essay that's been published. So, yeah, you literally have PDA features are juxtaposed against a bunch of autism features, and it's a bit of a problem. Like, again, with the language, you've got kind of classic, more straightforward, kind of easy. I don't... yeah, so it's just kind of, oh, and the key one is kind of this reinforcement-based approaches one. So again, like these reinforcement-based approaches like applied behavior analysis or positive behavior support, they are meant to not work with those with PDA, but they're meant to be kind of effective and gold standard with autism, which, as I previously noted earlier, is a nonsensical claim. But this is what we got to work with. So yes, I kind of mentioned how it's described as complex presentation. Autistic persons without PDA are therefore not complex, and therefore must be kind of easy or straightforward kind of presentations of autism. Just a moment. So yes, it's saying that people with PDA profile are viewed as more impaired than autistic persons without PDA profile of ASD. This is again applicable to those who apparently have a persistent drive for autonomy and meant to be more impaired compared to those without a persistent drive for autonomy. So yeah, so this is a diagram I created a couple of months back. So what you can see here is autism DSM-5, kind of profound autism and pathological demand avoidance, relative support needs compared to IQ, intellectual quotient. So the x-axis bottom is just IQ, and the y-axis is functioning or inverse support needs. Like I do kind of put here, please don't kind of reify it. Do not take it literally. It's just it's literally just it's just an aided discussion. So in the background, you can kind of see the big green circles, DSM-5 autism. Those people were meant to have low IQs, meant to be kind of profound autism, and they have high support needs, and is down in the bottom left, is hence this yellow circle, and this red circle on the lower right is pathological demand avoidance. It's meant to be again high support needs, but for people with high IQ. There's an entire thread I did on Twitter kind of explaining why I created this diagram and the logic and rationale behind it. But yeah, moving on. So this is another brief kind of case study, and how kind of like persistent drive for autonomy or kind of PDA Profile of ASD has been used to kind of try and create differences between autistic people. So this is a screenshot from this speakers for a PDA Space Summit. I'm drawing your attention to this text highlighted in blue. So this is taught by Rico Ryoku from like PDA versus ADA, so that's like autistic demand avoidance. So like difference between PDA and autistic demand avoidance and why it matters. So some people are literally taking this thing seriously, and I have issues with that. So yeah, so again, just to quote Rico Ryuki's talk title is PDA versus ADA, the difference between PDA and autistic demand avoidance and why it matters, again from PDA Space. And yes, it is referenced. Again, pointing out differences between functional categories often subjective and arbitrary, and often constructed from people's biases. So I've argued in my recent essay that came out in end of last year at Christmas that health psychology's PDA definitions used to construct their extreme demand avoidance group and their rational demand avoidance group seem arbitrary and constructed from their bias. They probably would challenge that, but I have argued it, and also pointing down here that recruiting PDA research participants from sources biased towards PDA profile outlook reduces equality of PDA studies, and that's noted in a recent systematic review, well, almost 2 years ago now. God, time has flown. We're about 3/4 way through this talk, so going to carry on. So just back to this diagram again. So I'm just using it to show that that actually this difference is used to kind of argue that some people saying that like PDA profile of autism here is different to other kinds of kind of demand avoidance. This diagram is actually valid, and it represents how PDA is being used in kind of practice amongst many kind of PDA profile of ASD advocates. So next one, again, and it's basically point out these diagrams are justified and merited, which is why we're on to this one. So yeah, autistic persons without PDA Profile of ASD are kind of more straightforward, less impaired. They kind of made this point again. Feeds into narrative surrounding PDA of ASD that is particularly impairing. Crime-specific approaches as traditional autism approaches do not work. And you can kind of see why this discourse is kind of used to do it, because if PDA is not, if PDA is no more, if the impairment between autistic people is the same irrespective of if they have PDA, and the strategies are the same irrespective of PDA, then the need for PDA as a diagnostic grouping, as a diagnosis or as a term, is just not there. So these kind of arguments for that are used to justify PDA, that they're needed to justify it, because without it, it just falls down. And for the record, I do not think that PDA is clinically needed. One reason why I reluctantly advocate for it being a thing as a diagnosis. It's a reason why I'm reluctant to advocate its use. Next slide. So, yeah, people get annoyed with me pointing out that a lot of claims for PDA Profile of ASD or persistent drive for autonomy seem nonsense, but a lot of them are when you actually contextualize them in broader discourses and you actually critically interrogate them and question them. It's a bit of an issue. Like saying like PDA profile. So just pointing out like autistic persons as a demographic are in great distress and suffering terribly from lack of suitable support. I kind of add on my previous article in 2017 on the topic to kind of point out that local autism services are being reduced due to UK government austerity policies due to lack of funding. It seems nonsense to claim that PDA Profile of ASD is a kind of complex presentation, and it's applicable to kind of claiming that persistent drive for autonomy is a complex presentation. It seems nonsense when so many of us are suffering terribly and in the actual dire state of the autistic population. One can reasonably argue that all autistic persons are complex for UK or kind of Western society cultures, because if autistic people's if any of us were easy to deal with, or a significant number of us were easy to deal with, the autistic population would not be in so much trouble as it is. Like a lot of us are just dying in dry and suicide, or filicide, or even kind of diagnostic overshadowing, like having our physical health issues being misinterpreted as features of autism. So yeah, it's the reason why I keep turning around and pointing out that a lot of stuff is just poppycock. So yeah, if you wonder why I say much of what's claimed about PDA Profile of ASD is nonsense, because they probably are when they are critically evaluated. We need to move on. This is kind of getting on to kind of final reasons for why I think that persistent drive for autonomy and PDA Profile of ASD are intrinsically ableist, is that you have instances of internalized ableism. So I don't want to linger on this, but this is a meme from Sally Cat that she did to me about 2 years ago, and he's attacking me due to my critique of PDA as a form of autism. And if you want to read it out, it's really not pleasant stuff. So in order for ableism to be internalized, something has to be ableist. So moving on with that. So if you want to know what a definition for internalized ableism is, it's when an oppressed group, i.e. autistic persons, as an example, internalize discourse that's used to oppress them, in this case kind of PDA Profile of ASD, and then they don't re-emit it internally within them, kind of creating conflict. So yeah, let's move on to, we're getting on to kind of final arguments now. So it seems that the kind of bold claims around persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy often seem to be subjective and or arbitrary in nature. Often, I would say, seem to be constructed from people's preconceived expectations of how PDA should present. If you're using kind of persistent and pervasive drive for autonomy as a name for kind of pathological demand avoidance, this is part of the same processes, practices, beliefs which are used to cast disabled people as less than human. So therefore, persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy is as ableist as PDA Profile of Next slide. Went too far. So think of trigger warning because I'm going to be talking about kind of autistic suicides and deaths. So if you want to skip the next slide, please do. Going to give you a second or two to do that. Moving on. So, yes, this is a quote from the 2015 England Autism Strategy produced by the Department of Health for England. So, yeah, this is just to go on the quote. So, this is particularly important for some people with autism, including those with Asperger's syndrome, who may face very significant challenges in their everyday lives, despite having average or above average IQ. It seems that autistic persons not attributed with PDA Profile of ASD often have their difficulties dismissed due to misconception it is a kind of mild autism or not autism at all. Persistent drive for autonomy propagates this issue, risking stripping away the limited support that autistic people already receive, and it's stripping away these support packages from a population that's in crisis. So when you do that, you're probably going to get even more autistic people attempting suicide, and obviously if you have more suicide attempts going on, more of these are going to be successful, so you're going to have more autistic people dying from suicide. Probably that persistent drive for autonomy or, well, our PDA Profile ASD will probably contribute to this happening. I'd also point out that I think that PDA Profile ASD, due to how it's constructed and how it seems to basically reattribute non-autism features to autism, is likely to contribute to preventable deaths through diagnostic overshadowing of people conflating physical health issues with people's autism. So why do you say this? Is because I and others have an article that's provisionally accepted discussing this issue with profound autism, of how profound autism will likely lead to diagnostic overshadowing of people's health issues being missed because people are conflating those physical health issues, just interpret them as autism features in the person. And if you look at those case studies, they involve kind of features that can be described as PDA Profile of ASD. We already have at least one case example of PDA Profile of ASD contributing towards a caregiver killing their child. So it does seem that PDA Profile of ASD, so persistent drive for autonomy, is likely to contribute towards avoidable deaths of autistic people. Moving on to the next slide. Am I likely to use persistent drive for autonomy at work? The answer is no. I am unlikely to use persistent drive for autonomy at work for these reasons and other ones. So, for example, persons like me and Damien Milton, who can be attributed with PDA, but are not strongly attached to it, I should say no. Dislike the name and prefer alternative terms for PDA. Sorry, there should be a not there. If PDA is a distinct diagnostic category, PDA is probably seen in non-autistic persons, and they're likely to be majority. And this matters because we don't know what the non-autistic person with PDA views is on PDA terminology is. Non-autistic person with PDA and those who are not strongly attached to PDA have equal rights to kind of PDA diagnosis, research and support. So hence this kind of slide is quite on topic. Next slide. Especially research tends to go with majority of persons' preferences on such matters, like terminology. So like using autistic persons' preferences for identity first language. That's like calling us autistic and not person first, so not saying person with autism. So yeah, demand-avoidance. I prefer to use demand-avoidance phenomena over terms for PDA because I think it's a better name for it. It does not bias people thinking about what PDA might be, and it also validates that people are experiencing very real difficulties. I think that's important that we do that because PDA has been used to describe some real harrowing and often quite difficult situations that people are in. There might be some of the factors which contribute to why I think persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy is intrinsically ableist, but this is the vast majority of them off the top of my head anyway. So concluding, PDA Profile ASD and persistent drive for autonomy are intrinsically ableist. It suggests that people with persistent drive for autonomy are ideally suited to neoliberal UK. Persistent drive for autonomy and PDA Profile ASD are functioning categories which are cast as complex presentation, while non-PDAs are easy presentations or kind of less impaired. That's a typo, should ignore that less. But yeah, it seems nonsense. It seems much nonsense is said about PDA, including persistent driver autonomy itself. I would stand by that claim. PDA is likely to contribute towards preventable autistic deaths. I should put avoidable there, but yeah, it will likely contribute towards it. I am unlikely to use persistent driver autonomy term in my work. So one of the reasons for me creating this video is that if any reviewers pick me up on it and go, well, they're saying persistent driver autonomy, I will just send them the video. So moving on. So this is my contact details. That's my contact email address if you got it. It's richardwas autism@gmail.com. Twitter handle is Richard_autism. It's my ResearchGate profile here if you want to see some ResearchGate work. I might add the slides to my ResearchGate because I think they're relatively important because of the material that's in them. But we'll move on anyway. So what I will put out is, I don't add the slides to them. I'll put a lot of the material in these slides are based on a Twitter thread I did over the last couple of days. I'll put a link to the Twitter thread into the video's description, so that way the core material can be still got access to it. So yeah, these are the references. There's only 20 in total, so there's only 3 slides. I'm not going to linger on them long. You can just pause the video if you want to access them. So yep. Second reference slide. Not much to say. And that's one for this is the next one. So thank you for your time and for watching this video. I hope you found it informative. And yeah, so goodbye.